On the night, a young Vrask warrior named Kessa Thorn earned the right to carry a dead human woman's name into battle. The elder Kaloth told the story the way it had been told for 11 years, standing before the fire pit at the center of Hollow's Reach, and every warrior in that circle, veterans and cubs alike, went as quiet as they had gone every year before. Snow fell soft and steady beyond the ring of firelight, the way it always seemed to fall on this particular night, as if the sky itself had decided, 11 winters ago, that this story deserved weather to match it. Old scars caught the firelight on a dozen different faces around that circle, warriors who had buried brothers and packmates in real battle, and every one of them sat as still and attentive as the youngest cub among them, because some stories a person never grows too hardened to hear again. Long before any of you were bonded, Kaloth began, the Vrask believed there was only one kind of courage worth naming. It walked into battle with claws bared and armor gleaming, and it died, if it died at all, with an enemy's blood on its hands and a war song on its lips. We had no word for any other kind. We did not think we needed one. We were, in our own quiet way, a very proud and a very narrow people, and it took a stranger from a world none of us had ever set foot on to show us exactly how narrow. He let the fire crackle for a moment before he continued, the old ritual pause that every cub in the circle had heard 11 times before and would hear 100 more before they understood it completely. Then, a human woman named Iris Wren taught us we were wrong, and she did it without ever once raising a weapon. 11 years earlier, when the joint outpost at Hollow's Reach was still new enough that neither species fully trusted the other, Iris Wren had been the outpost's junior biologist, 26 years old, assigned to catalog Vrask wildlife for a treaty neither government back home particularly believed would last. The Vrask warriors stationed alongside her had not been subtle about their opinion of the arrangement. Humans in the Vrask reckoning were soft-bodied and short-lived and worst of all unarmored, a species that had somehow built starships without ever developing the good sense to grow proper claws, and Warlord Drask Khan, who commanded the outpost's Vrask garrison, had said as much to her face during her first week on the ground, not out of cruelty, but out of the flat, unbothered honesty his culture considered a virtue. "You will not last a season here," he told her, watching her catalog specimens with hands that to his eyes looked distressingly delicate. "This world does not forgive softness." "I'm not trying to survive it by being hard, Warlord," Iris said, not looking up from her work. "I'm trying to survive it by paying attention. Different strategy. We'll see which one works out." She had not come to Hollow's Reach by ambition. She had come because the outpost needed a biologist willing to spend a 2-year rotation, somewhere most of her colleagues back home considered a career dead end. And Iris Wren had always had a soft spot for postings nobody else wanted, ever since she was a girl growing up on the edge of a wildlife reserve back on Earth, watching her mother nurse orphaned animals back to health with nothing but patience and a stubborn refusal to believe any creature was too far gone to save. It was not a trait that had served her well in every part of her life. It had cost her a relationship, a promotion, and more sleep than she cared to count. But it was the trait that had gotten her assigned to Hollow's Reach in the first place, and it was the trait, though she did not know it yet, that was going to define the rest of her short life and the long shape of a species not her own. Kaloth, young then, barely bonded to his first war beast, had laughed at that exchange along with every other warrior who'd overheard it, because it sounded, at the time, like the kind of thing a soft creature said right before the world proved her wrong. The Scareth were the reason the Vrask had never fully tamed the northern ranges, and the reason they revered them anyway. Great pack-hunting predators, armored along the spine, fast enough to run down anything smaller than themselves and fierce enough to occasionally kill things larger. The Scareth had been the Vrask people's oldest rival and oldest teacher both. The creature every Vrask cub was measured against before they were ever measured against another warrior. A Scareth den, discovered and left undisturbed, was considered sacred ground. To harm a Scareth cub, even by accident, was among the gravest offenses in Vrask law, a crime so old that most warriors couldn't tell you anymore whether it came from respect, superstition, or the simple accumulated wisdom of a species smart enough to leave the largest predator on the planet exactly where it wanted to be left alone. The ice collapse came in early winter, 11 years before Kessa Thorne stood in that circle waiting to hear her own new name spoken aloud for the first time. A cavern system beneath the Reach's northern ridge, home to a Scareth den with 6 cubs and a mother who had denned there for 3 seasons running, gave way without warning after a week of hard freeze and harder thaw, the ceiling of the outer chamber caving into rubble and sealing the den's only known entrance behind a wall of ice and broken stone. The mother Scareth had been out hunting when it happened. She returned to find her den sealed, her cubs trapped somewhere beyond a collapse too unstable to dig through with force, and she had gone, by every account from the warriors who witnessed it, quietly, terribly mad with grief in the way only a mother of any species can go mad, clawing at unyielding ice until her claws split and bled, unable to reach the small trapped sound she could still, faintly, hear crying from somewhere deep behind the rubble. Warriors who arrived early described a sound none of them ever fully managed to put into words afterward, something between a war cry and a wound, carrying out across the northern ridge for nearly an hour before the first rescue party reached the site. Drask Khan brought 6 of his best warriors to the site within the hour, armored, armed, ready to do whatever the moment demanded. It took them less than 10 minutes to understand there was nothing brute strength could offer here at all. The passage beyond the collapse narrows to less than half a meter, reported Vren Ashkal, the garrison's engineer, after forcing her own armored shoulders through as far as they would go and finding, 20 centimeters in, that they would go no further. She had torn her shoulder plating trying and did not seem to notice or care. No Vrask warrior fits through that gap. Not without removing armor entirely, and even unarmored our shoulders are too broad. We cannot dig from the surface without collapsing the inner chamber completely. I have run every calculation I know how to run, Warlord. There is no configuration of tools or bodies among us that reaches those cubs before the mother tears herself to pieces trying to reach them first. I do not know how to solve this. I do not think it is possible. Then we hold this position, Drask Khan said, and we honor what cannot be saved. It was Iris Wren, 12 minutes later, breathless from the run-up from the outpost, who looked at the narrow gap in the rubble and said the thing no Vrask warrior in that clearing had thought to say, because it had simply never occurred to any of them that the answer to an impossible problem might be a body built differently than their own. "I can fit through that," she said. Drask Khan turned to look at her with something that was not quite contempt and not quite disbelief, an expression the Vrask had no single clean word for. "That gap has already claimed the shoulders of my best warrior. You are smaller than she is, yes. You are also unarmored, untrained, and human. I will not authorize you to die in a hole in the ice for a creature that is not even your own world's to mourn." "With respect, Warlord, you're not authorizing anything," Iris said, already stripping off her outer coat, working fast, her hands steady in a way that surprised even her. "This isn't a Vrask decision. It's my body and my choice, and I'm not asking permission. I'm telling you what's about to happen so nobody panics when I go in." She looked at the gap, narrow and dark and utterly unforgiving, and did not let herself think too hard about what waited on the other side of it. An enraged, grieving predator 3 times her size who had no way of knowing a human meant her cubs no harm. "Somebody get me a light and something to carry a cub in. I'm not gonna have a free hand once I'm in there." Vren Ashkal pressed a small heat lamp into her hands without a word, because arguing had clearly stopped being useful several seconds ago, and Iris Wren, 26 years old, unarmored, untrained for anything resembling this, got down on her stomach in the snow and crawled into a gap in the ice that every warrior present had already privately decided was a grave. What happened in the dark beneath that ridge, nobody would ever know completely, because there was no one else small enough to follow her in and confirm it firsthand. What the warriors above could piece together, afterward, from the sounds carrying faintly up through the ice, and from what Iris herself managed to gasp out between each of her 4 trips back through the gap, was enough. The passage itself was barely wide enough for her shoulders, a crooked seam of broken ice and stone that dropped and twisted without warning, so narrow in places that she had to exhale fully just to force herself through, her heat lamp throwing wild shadows across walls close enough to touch on both sides at once. The cold down there was a different kind of cold than the winter air above, a cold that seemed to reach up through the stone itself and settle directly into bone. And more than once, she would admit much later to Vren Ashkal, in the dark, quiet moments between trips, she had genuinely believed the passage was about to narrow past the point she could still fit through it at all, and had kept moving anyway, because turning back meant leaving 6 cubs to die in the dark. And that was a math she found she could not live with even as a hypothetical. She found the mother Scareth first, trapped in the outer chamber alongside her cubs after all, not free as everyone above had assumed, wedged into a space too narrow for her own armored bulk to escape through even though her cubs, smaller, still could. The mother had been circling that inner chamber for hours by the time Iris reached her, wild-eyed, starving, half out of her mind with a grief and rage that made her, by every reasonable measure, the single most dangerous animal on the planet in that moment. Iris did not try to fight past her. She had nothing to fight with. She simply talked to her instead, low and steady, the same voice she'd have used on any frightened creature in her care, and inched forward one measured breath at a time, letting the mother smell her, see her, understand slowly that the strange, small creature crawling toward her cubs was not a threat, was in fact reaching for exactly the same thing the mother herself would have died reaching for. The first cub came out wrapped in Iris's own coat, carried against her chest through a gap barely wide enough for her shoulders, and when she emerged into the daylight, gasping, bleeding from a dozen small cuts where the ice had scraped her raw, Drask Khan took the cub from her arms without a word and simply stared at her, and something in his expression had already begun, quietly, to change. She went back in 3 more times. On the second trip she came out with 2 cubs. On the third, another 2. By the 4th trip, the last one, the mother Scareth had stopped circling entirely, had gone still and watchful in the way a creature goes still when it has finally understood, against every instinct it possesses, that the small crawling thing in its den means it no help. Iris reached the 6th and final cub, small and weak and barely breathing, wedged in a fold of collapsed ice too narrow for even her to fully enter, and she had to dig with her bare hands for 11 minutes, ice tearing her fingers raw, air growing thinner and colder around her with every passing minute, before she finally freed it. It was on the way back out, cub cradled against her chest, that the second collapse came, smaller than the first but enough, in that narrow, unstable passage, to bring down a final curtain of ice and stone directly behind her. She made it clear of the gap. The cub survived, small and shaking but breathing, cradled the entire way in arms that would not let go even as the rest of the passage came down around her. Iris Wren did not make it clear of the falling ice itself. She was already badly injured by the time Vren Ashkal pulled her the last half-meter free of the rubble, and though the outpost's medical team worked over her for nearly 3 hours in the freezing dark, there was simply too much damage, too much cold, too much of her own blood already lost in service of 6 small lives that were not her own species and never would be. The outpost's chief medic, a human named Dr. Os who had trained for 2 decades on wounds far less catastrophic than the ones Iris had taken to her chest and skull in that final collapse, worked with a desperation that Drask Khan would later describe, to warriors who had never once seen a human fight for another human's life, as something almost indistinguishable from Vrask battle fury, the same refusal to accept an outcome the body itself had already decided. It was not enough. Some wounds do not care how hard anyone refuses them. She died just after midnight, with Drask Khan kneeling beside her in the snow, 6 rescued Scareth cubs mewling weakly in a warmed enclosure 20 meters away, and the mother, freed at last through a wider dig from the surface, once the cubs were safely clear, packing anxious circles just beyond the firelight, unable to understand why the small, crawling creature who had given her back her children was the one now lying still in the snow. Vren Ashkal stood a few paces back through all of it, unable to make herself leave, unable to make herself come closer, holding the torn shoulder plate she had failed to force through the gap earlier that same day like it was somehow evidence of a debt she would spend the rest of her life trying to repay to a species she had known for less than a season. "Why?" Drask Khan asked her near the end, when she could still barely speak, his voice stripped of every trace of the flat certainty he'd greeted her with a season earlier. "They are not your kind. They will never know your name. Why did you give this much for creatures who cannot even understand what you gave them?" Iris managed something that was almost a smile, blood at the corner of her mouth, her eyes already losing focus on the cold, bright stars overhead. "That's kind of the whole point, Warlord," she whispered. "If I only helped the ones who could thank me for it, that wouldn't be courage, that'd just be trade." Her hand found his, gripping weakly, and held on. "Take care of them. Tell them someday somebody thought they were worth it. That's all I really want out of this." She did not speak again after that. The Vrask had never, in the whole of their long and blood-soaked history, named a warrior title after someone who died without ever raising a weapon. Drask Khan changed that within the month, standing before the full assembled garrison at Hollow's Reach, and he did not ask permission from anyone above him to do it, because for the first time in his long career, he understood there were some decisions that did not belong to rank at all. "We have always believed," he told them, "that courage wears armor and carries a blade. I believed it myself, for longer than I am proud to admit. I stood at the mouth of that cave and told a soft-bodied stranger she could not do what our own strongest warriors had already failed to do, and I was ready to let 6 cubs die rather than risk a life I did not yet understand the value of. She did not ask my permission. She simply crawled into a grave 4 separate times, for creatures who could have killed her by accident and never known her name, and I do not have a single word in our language large enough to hold what that was, so we are going to build one." He looked out over the circle of warriors, veterans who had buried brothers in real battle, standing shoulder to shoulder with cubs barely bonded to their first beast, and every one of them was listening, because in 11 years of command, none of them had ever heard their warlord speak with his voice breaking quite this openly before. From this day, any warrior who risks everything for a life that owes them nothing in return, who acts without the promise of glory or gratitude or a war song sung in their name, earns the right to carry hers. Iris Thorn, Hollow's Reach's own, though she was never born of it. Let every warrior who wears her name remember what she taught us the night she died, that the bravest thing a creature can do is help something that will never be able to thank it. And let it remind the rest of us, every year we speak it aloud, that we very nearly let our own definition of strength cost 6 innocent lives before a stranger showed us a better one. 11 years later, Kessa Thorn stood before the same fire pit, the same circle of warriors, waiting for old Kaloth to finish the telling so she could step forward and be given the second half of a name that 6 generations of Vrask cubs had grown up hearing spoken with something close to reverence. She had heard this same telling a dozen times as a cub herself, sitting cross-legged in the snow, never once imagining she would someday stand at the center of it. Beyond the firelight, in the dark hills above Hollow's Reach, the Scareth still denned, the same bloodline, mother to daughter, 11 generations removed now from 6 small cubs who had once been carried out of a collapsing ice cave in the arms of a woman who was never meant to survive the attempt. Drask Khan himself was long since retired from active command, his armor traded for a plain warm coat and a walking staff, but he had not missed a single one of these ceremonies in 11 years, and he stood now at the edge of the circle, close enough to hear, too proud in his old age to admit how much his eyes still stung every single time Kaloth reached the part of the story where he'd knelt in the snow and asked a dying woman why. He had never fully answered his own question, not in 11 years, not even now. He had simply learned to carry it, the way every warrior who took her name learned to carry something they could never entirely resolve, only honor. Kessa Thorne had not set out, 3 days earlier, to become anyone's legend. She had been a junior quartermaster, unremarkable by every measure the Vrask usually cared about, more comfortable with supply manifests than with a blade. And when the transport line running fuel to the outpost's forward listening post had come under a rockslide during a routine patrol, burying the convoy's rear vehicles and trapping 6 soldiers inside a cargo hauler with a ruptured coolant line slowly filling the cabin with toxic fumes. Nobody had expected the quartermaster to be the one who mattered. The armored recovery team, called in from the main garrison, was still 40 minutes out. The soldiers inside the hauler had perhaps 10. Kessa Thorne had looked at the narrow gap where the hauler's rear hatch had buckled, too tight for anyone in full armor, and had done the only thing that made sense to her in that moment, which was to strip off her own plating, the way she had heard the old story told every winter of her childhood, and go in anyway, dragging soldier after soldier out through a gap that tore her hands and knees raw, breathing fumes she had no proper filtration against. Until all 6 were clear and she herself collapsed in the snow alive, but only barely, having given nearly everything the moment had asked of her. Kessa Thorne, Kaloth said, and the whole circle went still. Tonight you have shown this garrison the same courage Iris Wren showed it 11 winters ago. You stood between a collapsing supply line and 6 wounded soldiers who could not walk, unarmored, alone, and you did not ask what it would cost you before you decided the cost was worth paying. Do you accept the name this outpost has carried in her honor since the night she died? Kessa Thorne knelt in the snow, in almost exactly the spot where Iris Wren had once knelt herself, and looked up at the elder with the particular steadiness of someone who had already made peace with what the name would ask of her every single day she carried it. I accept it, she said, and I'll try every day to earn it, not because anyone's watching, because that's the only way she ever would have wanted it earned. Kaloth placed one hand, old and scarred, against her forehead in the ancient gesture of nomming, and the whole circle rose to its feet as one. Warriors who had never met Iris Wren and never would, honoring a stranger from another world through the simple, stubborn act of remembering her correctly, year after year, long after every warrior who had actually known her was gone. Drask Khan, watching from the edge of the firelight with his walking staff and his old scarred hands, found that his eyes stung exactly as much this time as they had every single time before, and he had long since stopped being ashamed of that. Above the fire pit, somewhere in the dark hills that had never stopped being sacred, a scareth called out into the winter night, low and long, the same call its bloodline had been making for 11 generations, and every warrior standing in that circle understood, without needing to say it aloud, exactly whose name that call still seemed to be answering.